A native New Yorker, Thelma Golden is one of the most influential curators and museum leaders of her generation. She began her career at the Studio Museum in Harlem before spending a decade at the Whitney Museum of American Art, where she organised several landmark exhibitions, including Black Male, representations of masculinity in contemporary art, in 1994. She returned to the Studio Museum in 2000 and has since led it as its Ford Foundation Director and Chief Curator, making it a globally recognised home for artists of African descent and a vital cultural anchor in Harlem. I sat down with Thelma to talk about the art, literature, music and culture that have shaped her vision and her life. You've worked across this remarkable range of roles: curatorial work, museum leadership, roles in foundations and other civic institutions. Which of your core principles have remained constant across those roles? And how have those shifts also in those roles reframed your thinking?
I think I actually exist the same way in all of those roles. And that is, as someone who is guided fully by my deep passion for my own sense of the power and possibility of art. And that's what's made it possible. I often see my role refracted through all these lenses, and they're all the same.
You've had a signal role in the curation and the cultivation and helping build the careers of, in fact, scores of Black artists, going all the way back to Black Male and the shows you've done and overseen all the way since then. How do you think about exhibitions as platforms for holding culture, for introducing culture, for also interrogating ideas of representation and place and being?
I think of exhibitions as an important way to make and create and form narrative. And for me, as a curator, they have been a way to not simply answer questions, but to also ask them, right? And the hope, quite often, that those questions sort of prompt a dialogue that lead to more. You know, when I think about the fact that exhibitions that I made 30 years ago are still being discussed, they're often being discussed in different ways, and I love that because I feel that adds to the narrative.
Could you talk about any creative figures or works that have inspired you or influenced you? And here I'm thinking beyond visual art, into other spheres.
So many. I mean, we could start, you know, in my childhood. You know, my parents, while, you know, growing up, they were deeply invested in the way in which culture, and particularly African American culture, was able to teach us so much, allow us to feel and live within the celebration of Black history. So I grew up going to African American cultural events as a child. I grew up going to the Negro Ensemble Company and seeing plays there. I grew up going to Alvin Ailey Dance Theater and seeing, right, the dancers of that company in the 70s and the 80s in particular form my understanding of modern dance. I grew up in a home where music was always playing, very particularly across the spectrum of Black musics. You know, the jazz that my father listened to, the R&B that my mother, you know, listened to, the ways in which then as a young person, the sort of hip hop music that was being born, right, in this city in the time of my childhood, that was part of my brother and I's sort of formative years. I also was raised, you know, on pop culture. I've often said, right, my first understanding of what one would then call a Black artist was through watching Good Times and seeing the character JJ, whose work was represented on that amazing show created by Norman Lear by the artist Ernie Barnes, who I had the pleasure, of course, when I became a curator, to meet and to know. But as a child, watching that show in real time, watching JJ pursue an artistic career, clearly, right, was an early sense of influence on me. By the time I got to college, of course, I knew I wanted to be an art history major, but I double majored in African American studies. And that's where I engaged more deeply in a canonical study of African American culture. And in those years, I had the privilege, again, another gift that will live forever, right, as a turning point for me. But I was a student of James Baldwin, sat in a classroom with him.
Well, that's amazing.
You know, I continually think about the ways in which my entire life has been shaped, right, by works of art that I continually return to.
If you had to pass on any works, books, music to someone else, to other generations, what would you make?
You know, I'm continually amazed to rediscover my relationship to works that I think about in my memory, but then have come back to them as an adult, like the movie The Wiz.
Oh, tell me about The Wiz. Tell me about your relationship to The Wiz.
You know, I saw The Wiz as a young person and had already seen The Wizard of Oz and understood its transposition, right, into Black culture, but did not have a full sense of the iconography, but it worked on me in such a deep way, right? And it's only in, over time, the repeated viewings of that film that I understand again how much, at that age, it began to make me understand that I was committed to a worldview that understood the power of Black culture.
In June this year, you'll join the Genesis talks at LACMA in conversation with Michael Gove to reflect on what it means to open museums in this era. So a lot happened in the 8 years that Studio Museum was under construction. And as this museum enters a new chapter, how does this moment register culturally? And what does it suggest about how museums might respond to these changing times?
Yes. Well, I have taken an incredible amount of inspiration from our founding. The Studio Museum was founded in 1968. And at that time, our founders had a very bold vision in the midst of the political turmoil of that moment in this country, in this city, in this community. They understood that the struggle, the fight for liberation necessitated an involvement with thinking about the arts at the center. And I think that's what it means to be opening now. Yes, we are opening in this moment and very much believe that we are creating a space for an important dialogue with ourselves, with each other, with the past, with our present. But we're also creating a space informed by the vision and voices of artists to be able to chart new futures.
What conversations do you believe we need more of in the years ahead? Where do you see the greatest opportunity for those conversations?
I think we need more conversations that allow us to hold complexity with each other in ways that are bound by respect and understanding. But most importantly, we can do that in community. And the space of community that can happen in museums is one that formed me as a young person and one that I have been so privileged and proud to be able to form, to be able to make over these decades that I have worked, right, in museums, and particularly in the quarter century that I have been here at the Studio Museum.
Thank you so much, Thelma.
Thank you.
Thank you.